turn your mics on now, guys. Good evening. Welcome to the Frontline Club for this really interesting talk on Phil Miller's book, Keenie Meenie. Moderating tonight's event will be Nalini Sivathasan, from a broadcast journalist from BBC Asia Network. So over to you, Nalini.
Okay, thanks for getting my surname right. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming this evening. We're going to be talking about mercenaries, or private security companies, as they're kind of now known as. They're one of the most profitable industries in the world. Globally, the industry is estimated to be worth anything between £69 billion a year and £275 billion. So that's like a massive range. And part of the reason why we can't pinpoint how much they're worth is because there's such secrecy surrounding them. And Britain has one of the largest networks of private armies in the world. So since 2004, the British government has spent £50 million annually on them. And, you know, we still just don't know much about them. But in recent years, in the past decade, you might have heard of companies like Control Risks, G4S, Blackwater, in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. And some of these companies have been very controversial and have been involved in human rights abuses. And so through this book, we are going to talk about another private security company called Keenie Meenie. So I first came across it about 6 or 7 years ago when Phil Miller was just starting out as an investigative journalist. And he published a report about how Keenie Meenie was involved in the conflict in Sri Lanka in the 1970s and 80s, and how Keenie Meenie was training Sri Lankan security forces against Tamil Tiger rebels. And some of these security forces were then implicated in severe human rights abuses, some of which the UN have called war crimes. And so since that report was published, it's kind of evolved and it's turned into this book and a film, which looks at Keenie Meenie. And the book also expands from Sri Lanka, so it looks at Oman, Nicaragua, Northern Ireland, and in many of these countries, Keenie Meenie is directly or indirectly implicated in human rights abuses there. So I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Miller. He's now a journalist at Declassified, which is an investigations unit which looks at British foreign policy. And the film's director is Lou McNamara, she works as a camera operator and an assistant. So I think Phil's going to read an extract from the book now, and then we're going to see a trailer for the film.
Thanks, Nolly. So the book starts in the north of Sri Lanka, in October 1985 in a village called Piramantanaru. The early morning mist cloaks the village in a false sense of tranquility. Some hear the helicopters coming. Others slumber too deeply to realise the danger that is hurtling towards them. The Air Force base is only 20 miles away, so the thump of rotor blades is familiar. Today the noise is louder, a constant crescendo that never stops until the mist is shattered by olive green fuselages, probing the village's peaceful way of life and altering it permanently. Scores of soldiers stream out of 6 helicopters and disappear inside concrete irrigation channels that run like veins through the fields. One helicopter lands next to the house of a young woman, Thurarasa Saradar Dervi, and her 21-year-old brother, Pontharai Pakianathan. Terrified, Dervi runs inside and hides, but soldiers soon surround her house. The army ordered us to come out and kneel, she would later recount to a Tamil human rights group. There was another child with us who also knelt on the floor. Amid the terror, with life and death flashing before her eyes, one memory stood out. Among the helicopter pilots who landed in her village, she said one of them was a tall white man who was watching everything carefully. Many other people in my village saw him that day. Dervi struggled to make sense of this oddity. Villagers later referred to him as Mossadu, she said. I didn't know what it meant then. Later I learnt that Mossadu are overseas white men. Although Israeli security experts were almost certainly working in Sri Lanka at that time, the pilot she saw was not from Mossad. He was a mercenary from a British company, Keenie Meenie Services, or KMS Limited, which had begun flying Sri Lankan helicopters several months before this incident. As the white pilot watched over her village, Dervi's life began to fall apart. Soldiers captured my brother and tied his hands. They took him by the side of the helicopter and made him hold a rifle and took video footage. Afterwards, they brought my brother to the house and asked if he was an LTTE man. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam was a guerrilla movement fighting to free the island's Tamil minority from the ethnic Sinhalese majority. Dervi denied her brother was in the LTTE. "We are farmers, we are poor people doing farm work here only," she frantically told the soldiers, to no avail. "We were hit by guns and boots. They said my brother was LTTE and that they had a photo of him with a gun. If we did not agree with them, they would kill us and all the children." With that, they burnt our house down. More than 75 houses were ablaze. "There was smoke everywhere," she said. "We were all shouting and begging for mercy. They took my brother with them. I followed them crying and asked the army several times to release him. One soldier kicked me with his boots and I fell on the floor. After some time I opened my eyes. I could not see my brother." Other women managed to flee the village before the army surrounded them. One villager ran from lane to lane shouting out warnings. Uma Maheswaran took her 6 children and ran into the nearby forest. Her youngest child was only 6 months old. Many did not hear or heed the warnings. A survivor later followed the soldiers' boot marks, which stood out from the villager's modest sandals. The footprints led him to 7 corpses. Dervi, the lady who saw the white pilot, fled the village with her children. On their return the next morning, she said, "We saw so many dead bodies and could not find my brother. It took them 6 days to find his corpse. There were several stab marks and his hands were tied behind his back. They had stabbed and pushed him from the helicopter. All his bones were broken," she said. In total, 16 people lay dead and 30 more were injured. Their wounds included life-changing trauma that left them paralysed or deaf. The soldiers even mugged a farmer, taking his watch and 2,000 rupees before chasing him away. The farmer was so poor that he went back to the army to ask for his possessions. Then the soldiers killed him. Secret British government cables, finally declassified 3 decades later, support Dervi's claim that a white pilot took part in the atrocity. One diplomat said that a mercenary company, KMS, appeared to be becoming more and more closely involved in the conflict, and we believe that it's only a matter of time before they assume some form of combat role, however limited it might be. He noted, members of KMS are frequently seen both at hotel bars in Colombo and at private functions. Their identities and the role of the team as a whole are well known to the British community here. As 1985 drew to a close, the head of Britain's Foreign Office was informed by his staff that we believe only KMS pilots are currently capable of flying armed helicopter assault operations in Sri Lanka. In time, this mercenary air force would deliver decisive blows against the Tamil militants and civilians alike, at immense cost to their liberation struggle and incalculable profit to KMS. The bloodbath at Mercenary that day was not an anomaly, but set to become part of a gruesome pattern.
Wow. Okay, so now we're going to watch the trailer.
I was in the Special Air Service. Everyone knew about KMS. Keenie Meenie Services. It's just a term used by soldiers for people who are very keen and nasty.
They were not official government. They were a private firm, mostly from ex-SAS. Well, I think they killed people, basically.
As he flew over the area, his door gunner opened up and shot every man, woman, child and animal that he could get his eyes on.
A bloody lot had been dropped on the Tamils with grenades inside them.
I think there are equities that belong to other governments that are at stake here.
There were one or two British politicians who were connected to the company.
The company in the British government or other அதிர்ச்சி அளிக்குது.
I wasn't happy with the role that I was being asked to fulfil. There were a lot of undercurrents that were immoral.
Hello, Lieutenant Colonel Beatty.
No.
Do you accept any personal responsibility for war crimes that were committed in Sri Lanka, sir?
Lie down. Get over.
And now Phil's going to read another excerpt from the book.
Yeah, so the company's name, Keenie Meenie, is obviously quite intriguing. So I tried to get to the bottom of what it meant. No one really knew what this name meant, Keenie Meenie. Perhaps it was Arabic or Swahili, Maori or even Scottish. One insider claims it was simply a jovial term used by Scots soldiers for people who are very keen and nasty at their jobs and very eager to do well. A Ministry of Defence official who worked closely with the company has told me it was an Arabic expression for under the counter, implying that they specialised in clandestine operations, a turn of phrase recognised by one Omani I met who associated it with deviousness and intrigue. General Sir Peter de la Billiere, a former director of the SAS, has been quoted as saying Keenie Meenie was, in SAS terms, any undercover activity. Another possibility comes from Michael Asher, a former SAS soldier and accomplished linguist. He suggests that Keenie Meenie is a Swahili phrase describing the movement of a snake in the grass that was borrowed by British officers during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya to describe the counterinsurgency concept of pseudo-gangs. These were white policemen dressed African style, he said, with their faces blackened, who accompanied teams of turned ex-terrorists into the bush. The ideas of deception and facade are powerful images for understanding the firm's modus operandi. Was KMS really a private company, or was it just a mask worn by the British establishment to carry out deniable operations?
Thanks, Phil, for that. So before we get on to talking about Keenie Meenie, I just wanted to ask you about, mercenaries and kind of private security companies. They're not actually new, are they? They've been around for actually like hundreds of years.
Yeah, so I try and locate the book in this much wider context of the way the British Empire was built, largely by organisations such as the East India Company, starting from Queen Elizabeth I. And then I look at how, when the British Empire began to break up in the 60s and 70s, there was this generation of British military officers and special forces commanders who had a particular set of skills, repressing uprisings, and they felt they were able to take them out on the market in this way and use their skills to maintain a degree of British influence in parts of the world where Britain could no longer be seen to be formally involved. And obviously now the concept has become much more commercialised, with companies, Blackwater in Iraq being the most well-known one, but there's others who have taken on a more corporate entity, prefer to call themselves contractors rather than mercenaries. So Keenie Meenie are kind of the bridge between the colonialism and what we see now in these conflicts.
And what sparked your interest in it? Because, like we were saying, private security companies, there's so much secrecy surrounding them, and there's such a lack of transparency. Like, how did you find out about Keenie Meenie?
Yeah, the first time that the company's name was mentioned to me was by a Tamil refugee who came here in the 1980s, and he had this childhood memory of one of his uncles telling him that this company, there were British mercenaries involved in the war. And at that time I was studying at university, and there was a group on campus that supported refugees and asylum seekers, and we realised there were a lot of deportations back to Sri Lanka. This was 2011, so after the war had finished, and we heard reports that when Tamils arrived back in Sri Lanka they were being tortured, and the Home Office knew about this, and yet the deportations were still going ahead. So this got me kind of questioning what was Britain's foreign policy towards Sri Lanka. And was this kind of repression of the Tamils something new, or did it actually have a much older and disturbing historical precedent in the shape of this company, Keenie Meenie Services? So that's what first got me interested in investigating the company.
So, in terms of the Sri Lankan Civil War, for a lot of people here, it's a very distant conflict. It seems like we are very removed from it, or Britain is very, very removed from it. But why did Britain care so much about what was happening in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, well, there's a Tamil intellectual called Sivanandan who had a saying, he's passed away now, but he had a saying about refugees, we are here because you are there. And I think in the case of Tamil refugees, a lot of them came here in the 1980s at the time when this British mercenary company was there and was involved in atrocities. So I think there's that dimension that interested me. But in terms of Britain's interests in Sri Lanka, this was something I tried to get to the bottom of by looking at the declassified files from this period, which have just come out under the 30-year rule. There was a kind of hazy sense of a need to maintain British interests in the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka being located in the centre of the Indian Ocean, it was seen as very important for shipping lanes. And there's a harbour in the north of Sri Lanka in a town called Trincomalee, which the Tamil movement wanted to be their capital. And Admiral Nelson described Trincomalee as the finest harbour in Asia, very deep water, very sheltered harbour. And so the Foreign Office in London were worried that the Tamils, they perceived them as slightly more left-wing than the majority Sinhalese community, and they thought if the Tamil movement was successful, then the Soviet Union might gain some more interest in this naval harbour in the north of Sri Lanka. But again, all these interests were quite marginal and finely balanced. I think an argument could have been made the other way, but there was this concern in the Foreign Office, and a chain of events was set in motion which resulted in Keenie Meenie being there and being involved in massacres like the one in Piramantanaru.
And why couldn't the British government just send troops in directly to kind of into the country? Like, why did they have to go through this private security company?
Yeah, so again, there were geopolitical concerns that come out in the files. In the 1980s, India, which is Sri Lanka's bigger neighbour, was one of the largest customers of British weapons, on par with Saudi Arabia at that time. So the Foreign Office was very keen to have good relations with India in order to sell them more weapons. And India, which has its own Tamil population, was supporting the Tamil movement in Sri Lanka. So Britain didn't want to be seen to be overtly suppressing the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and so Margaret Thatcher's special advisor on foreign affairs suggested that this venture might be privatised, is the language that he used in one of the files. And from that moment on, they started to have these discussions about whether companies like Keenie Meenie could do the role. And that basically gave the British state a layer of plausible deniability. They could say KMS is a purely commercial operation in which we have no role, although the chairman of Keenie Meenie was a former aide-de-camp to the Queen. So they were very intimately connected to the British state.
And I want to bring Lou into this now. So how much did you know about like mercenaries, about the Sri Lankan conflict, like before you got involved with the film?
So like a lot of people in the UK, I think, I knew very, very little about the conflict in Sri Lanka and very little about mercenaries. But I had worked with Phil before. My first documentary was called Working Illegally, and it was based on Phil's, again, very thorough research into the private security companies who were running immigration detention centres in the UK. So that's G4S and Serco, Mighty, and profiting from having detainees working jobs for £1 an hour, essential to running the centres. So when he came to me with his next report, I trusted him, and we started working together, and I've been learning a lot ever since, with amazing collaborators along the way.
So for the film, Lou, you went to Sri Lanka, and you spoke to Tamils that were affected. In terms of the STF, so who were trained by Keenie Meenie, like what's their significance? Like, how feared or how powerful are they in terms of the Sri Lankan security forces?
So the STF stands for Special Task Force. They're technically a wing of the police, but they look nothing like any police I've ever seen. They wear kind of full military gear. They've got the latest weapons, the best training. And when you mention their name to any of the Tamil survivors I met in Sri Lanka, people are absolutely terrified of them. They received this special training from KMS that allowed them to operate in a way that the army wasn't able to, doing jungle warfare, breaking through lines and getting through to civilian areas much more easily than the army could, which meant they were the ones who were able to get into civilian villages and disappear people, abduct people, torture them, and that legacy really lives on. They're still terrifying people today. Actually, when we were out for the first time filming in Sri Lanka, we met the family of a 17-year-old boy who had been chased by the STF with guns for the crime of stealing sand. And he was so terrified of the STF that he jumped into this river and drowned rather than not run away from them. And the family were mourning the death of their 17-year-old son when we met them. And they said, yeah, if it wasn't for this kind of intrinsic fear of the STF, that would never have happened. And that was totally deliberate. When we met the former director of intelligence, the second time I went out to Sri Lanka, he spoke about how the whole aim of this KMS training was to instill a fear psychosis, those are his words, in the Tamil people. And yeah, I think they were successful.
And I think there was one bit in the book, Phil, where they said that kind of the STF's like signature style was to put burning tyres onto people, and then obviously there would be no evidence or no remains left. That kind of became one of their signature kind of moves, wasn't it?
Yeah, we interviewed a priest in a part of Sri Lanka where this unit that was set up and trained by the British mercenaries was very active, and he said, you would just see tyre down the side of the road, and these tyres had been set on fire, and Tamil people had been burnt to death in them. So that was
I mean, how many of them were civilians, and how many of them were Tamil Tiger fighters?
So there was kind of a crude policy in the east of Sri Lanka to arrest all men between 18 and 30. And so these were men who were basically swept up in these kind of fishing expeditions. And this went on to be a kind of hallmark of the conflict, and it was also used against the majority Sinhalese population later in the conflict, when some of the Sinhalese community rose up against the government, and Sinhalese civilians were killed in the same way as well. So all communities in Sri Lanka have suffered as a result of these units that British mercenaries, in the case of the Special Task Force, they set up the unit and trained it. In the case of the helicopters, it was British pilots who were flying the helicopters directly.
Okay, I think we're going to watch another clip from the film now.
Keenie Meenie started training Sri Lankan forces in 1984. For the next 3 years, they taught the STF how to be professional, disciplined, and respect the rule of law. But the operations they carried out, whilst under the training of the
Lou, you worked with Rachel Schweiger, so you guys were out there, weren't you?
Yeah.
As well as Phil?
So the first time when we were meeting survivors in the north and the east, we were there as all three of us, and then Rachel and I went out again to meet with some of the security forces 6 months later.
And so in terms of, obviously, in terms of making the film, you know, you're needing like strong visuals, but with the book, so much of it is based on historic things that happened in the past, and you know, historical archives and stuff like that, and also the nature of what Keenie Meenie was doing was so secretive. So how difficult was it to kind of visualize that and kind of transform them on screen, and also filming in Sri Lanka? What was that like?
Yeah, lots of challenges. So the book was released in January, but along the whole time that Phil was interviewing people for the book, we were there recording those interviews and tracking down Tamil survivors, family members who told us their stories. Lots of people for these interviews had to be anonymous for their own safety, especially people living in Sri Lanka currently. We managed to interview one of the mercenaries themselves who turned whistleblower at his house in Prague, and we even eventually gained access to Sri Lankan security services themselves, who were actually incredibly proud to tell us about their work with the British mercenaries. We were also lucky enough to be able to work with some journalists in Sri Lanka who, again, anonymously for safety reasons, have provided us with footage of various events, and being out there ourselves, it's like a visually incredibly stunning and beautiful country, which I guess provided lots of material to work with in the film, where there are those things that are historical and talked about and that we don't, you know, that you can't have footage of because they were never filmed at the time.
And were you asked questions? Because especially in the north and the east, it's very militarized. So you'll see there's members of the army everywhere. And, you know, getting out a camera is, is going to raise questions. And also being white as well, probably. So how different, did you have to kind of film quite secretly? Or?
Yeah, that was definitely another challenge. So when we were filming, especially with survivors, we didn't want to draw attention to the fact we were filming as well and put them at further risk. So we kind of went around looking like tourists. We had small cameras, small setup, very limited lighting, all carried in those kind of big tourist rucksacks, and Phil in his wonderful Hawaiian t-shirts. And we had to film interviews indoors, often with really limited lighting as well, in cramped spaces and challenging locations, inside churches, basically wherever we could that was safe and that we weren't drawing attention to ourselves. And one of the most annoying challenges was with the security services who never wanted to turn the aircon off. So you've got that dreadful aircon sound.
And it's amazing because you actually managed to get access into an STF training camp. How did you manage to do that?
It was really unexpected. We went over there tentatively trying to meet with some officials we'd been in touch with. And then we were suddenly welcomed with open arms. And I think the fact that we were both white and both perceived to be British, Rachel is Irish but was assumed to be British there, meant we were just immediately accepted, barely asked to explain ourselves in lots of situations. And the leaders of the training camp were really eager to show us around and proudly tell us about their working relationship. Most of the leaders of the training camp were themselves trained by KMS when they were young recruits in the 80s. And more recently, they've been working with Police Scotland and have been over to Scotland, had Scottish police over there. So yeah, everybody was very happy and welcoming to us. We were even sat down for a kind of formal group photo, which was a strange and uncomfortable moment for us. And actually, yeah, I've got a clip to show here of a kind of gymnastics display that was put on at the training camp with the 100 newest recruits. With just us watching, which, yeah, we totally didn't expect. It lasts about 20 minutes, so this is a short montage of bits from it.
Yes, so bizarre because we were talking about this clip beforehand, and it just makes me laugh, even though it's really, you know, these forces were then involved in human rights abuses, but it's just really surreal, must be, seeing that.
It was so, I mean, the whole day we were shown kind of abseiling and short gun ranges, long gun ranges, hostage situations, kind of live rounds constantly, and then suddenly to see this with, this kind of hyper-masculinity going all day, and then suddenly this dance routine was really disorientating.
But so did they think that you were kind of making a film that was going to showcase the STF, or what did they think you were there for?
We just spoke about, told them we were working on a project about the British relationship, and specifically the KMS relationship with the STF, so they were very happy to talk about that. The other side of things, the kind of KMS side, the mercenary, is much more tight-lipped, and they don't want to mention it at all, generally. But yeah, we didn't find that from the STF at all.
It kind of reminds me, I don't know if anyone's watched The Act of Killing, where you kind of, you're hearing from the perpetrators about how they've committed all these crimes, but there's kind of no remorse or anything. They're very proud of it.
I think there's been very little accountability for those people in Sri Lanka since the war, so there's not really a sense of guilt or shame around it, and the connection to KMS and Police Scotland also lends a kind of credibility that they're happy with. So yeah, it feels like a disjuncture from our perspective, but I guess it kind of makes sense from their perspective.
And so we've spoken a lot about Sri Lanka, but obviously in the book talks about Oman and Nicaragua. Phil, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Keenie Meenie's most lucrative contract seems to have been in Oman, in the Middle East, where they were instrumental in supporting Sultan Qaboos, who ruled Oman for nearly half a century. And what they did in Oman was very similar to their role in Sri Lanka. They set up a special forces unit. Again, it was former SAS veterans who went out there to do the training, but also in Oman, their staff were the commanders of the unit. In Sri Lanka, they were just the chief instructor, but in Oman, they were the commanders. They went out in operations with the men, and this was basically a unit designed to stop a successful rebellion against Sultan Qaboos, who was an unelected tyrant who ruled for half a century. And he was one of Britain's closest allies in the Gulf as well. So there was a clear theme in Oman that they wanted to support British interests by propping up a repressive dictatorship. Conversely, in Nicaragua, Keenie Meenie were on the side of the insurgents. So from 1984, there was a democratically elected left-wing government in Nicaragua, and the Reagan administration were very keen to overthrow this government using people like Oliver North, who you saw in the trailer. So Oliver North worked with David Walker, who was a director of Keenie Meenie Services, and is alleged to have orchestrated the bombing of a hospital in the capital of Nicaragua. There were also various attempts to obtain surface-to-air missiles for the Contras. So in Sri Lanka, Keenie Meenie were flying helicopter gunships, and in Nicaragua, they were involved in attempts to shoot down or sabotage helicopter gunships. That was because Thatcher supported Reagan's policy in Central America at that time. So in terms of the tactics that Keenie Meenie would use, when it suited them, they would use terrorist tactics, they would use bombs, they would use sabotage. And then in other contexts, when Britain's interests were to keep that regime in power, then they would have the legitimacy of embedding themselves with a special forces unit or with an air force. But there was no real morality about what they would do. The lengths they were prepared to go to.
And so, we talked about Sri Lanka and this fear that the British government had of sort of the Soviet Union's influence, and these kind of leftist groups who were kind of gaining power. But what was the kind of the wider geopolitical context in which Keenie Meenie was operating? Was it in all these places this fear of like leftist groups?
Yeah, there was definitely this Cold War dynamic of kind of anti-communism, there was also this kind of colonial hangover, not in Nicaragua, but certainly in Oman and Sri Lanka, that these were places that had been British colonies or protectorates, and they kind of felt there was nothing wrong in keeping that level of control. I think Colonel Johnson, the chairman of KMS, his father had been a tea planter in Sri Lanka when it was a colony. So there was this long connection with these parts of the world. And I think there was a real resentment to any kind of autonomous movements. I mean, the Tamil movement, they don't really fit neatly on the ideological spectrum, but they were very autonomous in what they wanted to do. They wanted to run that part of the island their way. And I think there was a fear in the Foreign Office of things they couldn't control, of autonomous movements, not necessarily left or right, but just the non-aligned and the independent struggles.
And so, Keenie Meenie kind of had its peak in the sort of 1980s.
Yeah.
What's happened since then? I mean, are they still around?
Yeah, so their peak was in Nicaragua, where they were working with Oliver North. And when the US Congress began its inquiry into the Iran-Contra affair, the leader of the Contras testified to the US Congress and started to shed light on the involvement of British mercenaries in Nicaragua. And Oliver North also went on the record and named David Walker. So that side of their operations became public at the time, but their work in Sri Lanka has stayed much more secret because the British files have only just been declassified. So what Keenie Meenie did, their main director by that point was this chap David Walker, and they had a kind of parallel entity called Saladin, which was working out of the same office in South Kensington. And when the US Congress started investigating Keenie Meenie, David Walker seems to have scaled up Saladin's prominence. So that became the dominant entity, and Keenie Meenie was scaled back, and it becomes very hard to I can't give you a precise date when Keenie Meenie shut down. They based their accounts offshore in the Cayman Islands and in Jersey. And those records aren't available anymore. But Saladin became much more prominent and tried to do more respectable operations, some cybersecurity stuff, providing protection to companies like oil and gas companies and so on. It seemed to step back from these direct mercenary operations as such, although it still became involved in some controversy. One of Saladin's subsidiaries got a very lucrative contract in Somalia to effectively act as their coast guard, and they had about a 50% share of Somalia's fishing revenue for a period of time until the Somalia's fishing minister raised concerns about how unfair this contract was. But yeah, David Walker's still around. I think it was only in the end of 2018 that they finally left the office in South Kensington, where they'd been recruiting pilots for Keenie Meenie in Sri Lanka, and moved to a different part of London. But we also found a letter.
When I met with the commander of the STF, Latif, he proudly showed us a letter from David Walker that was in commemoration of one of the founders of the STF having died recently, and it was written on Saladin-headed paper, and it kind of clearly stated that Saladin was a direct continuation of Keenie Meenie, and that they were still very kind of proud and happy with the long-standing relationship they had together.
And in terms of the book, it shows how kind of linked the British Foreign Office was with Keenie Meenie. How have the government and the Foreign Office kind of responded to kind of all these allegations in your book?
Yeah, they've kind of been keeping their heads down so far. I think they're worried to see what happens next. So a lot of what I've used in the book is the Foreign Office's own files. So I'm kind of using their own words, which makes it quite hard for them to rebut what I'm saying. There are still sections of the archive that aren't available to the public. I found while writing the book there was over 200 files that had been destroyed about British foreign policy towards Sri Lanka. And other documents are being redacted or held back altogether. And in the last couple of weeks, the Foreign Office finally responded to one of my freedom of information requests, and they sent a telegram which has KMS at the top, so the telegram's clearly about KMS, but then the rest of the page is all blacked out. I think we have it up on the carousel, it's been going around tonight. But yeah, so that's since the book's been published, they're still refusing to. There's certain information about KMS that they still feel is too sensitive to make public. They've also started doing funny things like the name of that mercenary who shouted, who, you know, we had that conversation from his upstairs window. That was declassified, and now any further references to him they seem to be redacting in the latest disclosure. So there seems to be this retrospective effort to try and, what's the phrase, bolt the stable after the horses bolted.
Yes, and you know, back then in the 80s, you know, there was this kind of threat of the Soviet Union and these leftist organisations. You know, are mercenaries being used now? And if so, like what kind of conflicts are they being used in? You know, what's motivating them in these different countries?
Yeah, so obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan there was a huge surge in contractors, as they like to call themselves. And more recently there's been a lot of focus on the Russian mercenary group Wagner, operating in Syria, Ukraine, Libya, Mozambique, Central African Republic. When, just as my book was coming out, I was invited to an event at a defence think tank where they were talking about possible responses to this issue of Russian mercenaries and whether there should be more international regulation. And there was quite a senior representative there from a British private security company, who I won't name, but it's a household name. And he stood up and said, I'm not a mercenary, I'm a businessman, and there's nothing that Wagner Group is doing that my company doesn't do. I just can't compete with them on price. So that was quite fascinating. And he also said, if you want to extract oil and gas from parts of the world like Mozambique, you need private security there to do it. So I think that there's very unlikely to be international regulation against these types of companies. The Foreign Office has lobbied pretty hard to stop international regulation in the past. So I think there's still this kind of Machiavellian attitude to international affairs where the big powers will want to be able to use mercenaries as it when it suits them. But of course, when it doesn't suit them, then they'll pretend to deplore this kind of private army type activity.
And so, you know, when you were speaking to people, but both of you, you know, when you were speaking to people who were part of Keenie Meenie, like now looking back, did they show any kind of remorse? Did they feel guilty? Like, how did they kind of look back at their time?
So the mercenary who is willing to speak to us, I think was willing because he feels very conflicted about his work with KMS in Sri Lanka. He was there for quite a short amount of time, a matter of months, before he decided that he was on the wrong side of history and he needed to get out. In his own words, he kind of didn't know how to whistleblow. He was young, he didn't have any connections or know how to do that, so he kind of made his excuses and left and got out. But feels that what was happening was totally immoral, and that's, I believe, why he was happy to speak to us about it.
And in terms of the actual film itself, you know, kind of, who do you see as the audience for this? Because in some ways it's quite a niche topic, but then other ways it isn't. And kind of, this is both your first film, right, for both of you? Of this feature film. Yeah, what's that process been like in terms of getting it kind of into mainstream audiences, getting it picked up?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. It's been easier to get the book out there than the film so far. I think that the publishing industry is a bit more open than TV and film. So the book came out in January. The first print run has sold out already and has been reprinted. And it's been favourably reviewed in the Daily Mail, the Irish Times, a huge cross-spectrum of publications. But there's particular interest from the Tamil community, of which there's around 200,000 Tamil people, particularly in London. And so I think this is the 5th event we've done, and everyone has been sold out. And I think when the film comes out as well, there'll be even more interest. But I think there's a lack of reporting on British foreign policy that is both objective and critical. So this is all based on freedom of information requests, interviews with insiders, government files. So it's very rigorous, and it's very critical. It paints a very unfavourable light of British foreign policy. And I think there is a commercial audience for that, but it's kind of untapped because we're not used to having these kind of reports. Normally, we learn about the SAS through programs on television, such as SAS. Are you tough enough? Is that what it's where you see people doing the fitness test, or veterans writing their memoirs in very kind of like Boy's Own type tales. They don't really tell you much about the politics or the unsavoury side of why they were in these countries. So I think that's made it hard, particularly with television, because commissioners aren't that used to doing this type of story. I think when World in Action was around, there was more of this kind of reporting going on. But yeah, hopefully that can change.
Definitely had lots of frustrating responses from commissioners and execs who seem to think their audiences need more dumbed down content or wouldn't be able to handle the complexities or the nuances of a story like this, which I think is irresponsible, frankly. British audiences need to be aware of what their government does in their names and without their knowledge. So I'm really keen to get it out to British audiences.
And my final question is, since the book's come out, kind of what impact has it had? You mentioned obviously the Tamil community. They've shown a big interest in it. Like, what? Yeah, will it result in any change?
Yeah, well, Rachel, who you saw in some of the footage, she's a criminologist, and she's just this week submitted a complaint about Keenie Meenie to the UN has a working group on mercenaries. And she's catalogued all the abuses that the company were involved with and asked why the British authorities haven't investigated the surviving members of the company who are still active or residing in the UK. So potentially that might lead to some kind of international criticism of the UK government's attitude or lack of action on Keenie Meenie. But yeah, I mean, the lessons really haven't been learnt. So the same unit that you see there, the Special Task Force, which has this horrendous reputation for massacres and disappearances, is currently being trained by the Scottish Police in techniques like intelligence gathering and public order techniques. So, British aid money is being used to pay for Scottish Police to go out and retrain a unit that was originally set up and run by British mercenaries.
And there's just no kind of structure for accountability. When we asked them about, they've been doing this training for a number of years now with the STF, and we asked how they were reviewing that process. They had some kind of garbage about it being a 9-month cycle, which meant that they could never review the process and had to start the next 9-month cycle the following year again, which means they kind of uncritically go back to continue this work, despite the fact there's still kind of documented horrible things going on, such as the murder of the 17-year-old boy, ongoing accusations against the STF, and particular kind of harsh public order methods used as well on student and non-violent protests.
Great. So I think thank you so much, Phil and Lou. So we're gonna open it up to questions, and also after this, you'll be able to get Phil's book. Apparently, it's on offer for £10. So So any questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, everything you said. And I congratulate you for your work. My question is really in two parts. One is if you know why the United States were investigating Keenie Meenie. And the other one is if you think that to the millions who died in the world, not only in Sri Lanka, from weapons, from missiles, rockets, Scud missiles, whatever, bombs, grenades, landmines, and for the billions of relatives, of bereaved relatives, it makes a difference if the bullet that killed their dear son or husband or father came from a legal army or from an illegal army. What difference does it make? what the governments are the first ones to do something illegal, because they themselves say in the United Nations Charter for Peace that wars are illegal, and they are the first ones to organize wars. All the wars and all the this business of buying and selling weapons is all done because of governments. They allow it all, and they have, not only Britain, all governments have private companies that specialize in selling for children armies, selling for any terrorist groups that they cannot sell officially. They need private.
So is your question, does it matter to the survivors who pulled the trigger?
The weapons that we have to get rid of. It is militarism, not people making money. Maybe, of course, they are all businessmen. They make money. I speak to many people. I have a movement for working against militarism called Humanity United for Universal Demilitarization.
Okay, thank you.
So this is what I think we have to do.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Yeah, so in terms of your first question, why was the US investigating Keenie Meenie? They weren't at first. They were looking into Oliver North, and when his safe, when the safe in his office was opened, they came across this diagram he'd drawn, which had the name KMS written on there. So that was the first indication that the congressional investigators had that there was this company involved. And in terms of what difference does it make whether it was, say, British or French mercenaries, I think it's particularly interesting for British Tamils, who often want justice for what's happened, and it's very hard for them to get justice in Sri Lanka. When I've spoken to British Tamils and told them about what Keenie Meenie did, it makes it much more closer to home in the fact that, here's something that Britain has been responsible for, and it kind of changes maybe their approach to the demands they make. Rather than just making demands on Sri Lanka or the UN, they're also making demands on the UK and a country where they have more power to actually influence what happens.
Anyone else? Yep.
Hi. I'm going to go off piste a little bit here. In 30 years' time, when hopefully the British archives are going to be released about Syria, what do you think they're going to say about the British involvement in Syria? I'm mindful that we get out of the internet traffic quite a bit of information about how some English speakers with British accents are involved in control mission centers in Jordan, orchestrating some of the activities in Hama and some of the other southern cities, and for example the White Helmets and the Scottish connection is interesting here, that they get given donated ambulances by Scottish hospitals to them, and the person who sets them up is an intelligence officer. So that's one question. What do you expect is likely to come out? Secondly, you mentioned Oman. There is an interesting direct line between Keenie Meenie then and the Quds force in Iran, because the Iranian army was also involved. The special services were involved in Oman at the time as well. In your mind, how different is Keenie Meenie and the Quds force? They're both doing, their policymakers doing. How different are they?
So obviously it's terrible what's happening in Syria all these years. I think in 30 years' time, what will we learn about British involvement? Probably not much more. So there is an issue in that British special forces, who were the primary British military units operating in Syria at the moment. British special forces are exempt from freedom of information requests, and they're not required to give their files to the National Archives. So part of the reason why I've been able to find out so much about Keenie Meenie is because they're not covered by those exemptions. And so they haven't been able to redact, well, they've redacted a lot, but they haven't been able to redact all the references to Keenie Meenie. So the Daily Mirror had a report, I think on Saturday, that an SAS soldier had been injured in Syria and had been evacuated to Cyprus. And last year I revealed that the only British soldier to die in Syria had actually been killed by friendly fire and not by an ISIS landmine, as the Ministry of Defence had initially told us. And that was because I got the records from the inquest, which happened in Hereford. And none of the British defence correspondents seemed to have covered the inquest. I was working for a very small newspaper at the time. And I broke the story, and I think that just shows the lack of critical reporting that's going on in terms of British foreign policy. We're too reliant on MOD press releases, or happy to take MOD press releases, and I think that has consequences for the people in these covert units, because there's no independent scrutiny really about whether lessons are being learned when missions go wrong. We don't know if the equipment that was used in the friendly fire incident, a grenade detonated and killed this man. We don't know whether that type of grenade is still being used on these missions, whether it was an isolated fault or a broader issue. So I think from the perspective of the people in these elite units, that they also have an interest in a degree of transparency and independent scrutiny, which our allies are much more mature at. The US Special Forces, the Australian Special Forces, New Zealand Special Forces, Canadian Special Forces are all much more subject to either their version of freedom of information or parliamentary inquiries. So yeah, I think that we won't know much more, but I think there's a lot more going on in Syria than we do know about. And yeah, this comparison between Iran's Quds Force and KMS, yeah, I think there are similarities. And I think the reality is all regional powers or superpowers will seek to use militias, paramilitary forces, and deniable units and mercenaries to pursue their interests.
And just following on from that, like how does Britain's use of private security companies compare with other countries in the world?
Yeah, so in terms of private security, so not all of them are doing combat operations. Some of them are just doing bodyguarding and so on. But we do have one of the largest, if not the largest, private security industries in the world. Hereford, where the SAS is based, is a particular hub. And also in London, because of companies like Lloyd's and this long history of maritime insurance brokers, there's been a spin-off industry of counter-piracy companies who were particularly active in the Horn of Africa around Somalia, and they also use Sri Lanka as a jumping-off point for transit across the Indian Ocean.
One of the things that the mercenary who we did speak to mentioned was that on leaving the British Army, having been in the Special Services, he had no other job opportunities. There was nothing done to kind of prepare him or rehabilitate him into civilian life, and having been in the Army since the age of 14, he had no other qualifications to fall back on, and that it was very, very easy to kind of be slipped into, I think he called it the circuit. So every time you take a job, somebody else is moving on from the next job, and every time someone moves on, it just goes round. It's a very small, closed network, but it's very common for people to move straight from the Special Forces into that.
Any other questions? Yeah, so the man with the tie over there.
Thank you. There's another unregulated industry, which is NGOs. I wonder whether you've done any research, because I know years and years ago when I worked in Haiti, people seem to be recruiting from, is it Executive Outcomes, I think was the ex-South African army. So, and you know, he very proudly told me about how he murdered somebody in Angola, and so I wondered if you'd done any sort of research on the links between those two.
So it's a good question. The UN itself will employ some of these companies to provide security for its staff around the world. And NGOs do the same. I mean, as journalists who operate in conflict zones, journalists will often go on kind of hostile environment courses run by former SAS guys, some of whom work in these companies, and former SAS guys can make a living as bodyguards for journalists. So yeah, it's a very good point. You can't, if you're going to an unstable part of the world, you can't always completely wash your hands of private security. But I've not come across NGOs using contractors for offensive combat operations. But it's not something I've looked into in much depth. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. There were a few more questions. The lady over here.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit about the financing of it. What amounts of money are we talking about? Where's the money coming from? Maybe salary as well?
Yeah, so the company's finances are difficult to get hold of because they were using an address in Jersey in the Channel Islands, which is a low regulation jurisdiction, and also in the Cayman Islands as well. But the British High Commissioner in Sri Lanka wrote a telegram where he said the company was earning millions of pounds each year from the contract in Sri Lanka, which at that time in the 1980s, was a lot of money, and it was also a lot of money for Sri Lankan taxpayers. I think one of the reasons why Sri Lanka stopped using the company eventually was because it was just so expensive for them. But for the actual, the junior guys in the company, Robin said what he was earning about £2,000 a month tax-free, which at the time was more than he was earning in the SAS and more than he'd been earning as a bodyguard for Mohammed Al-Fayed. But it was kind of equivalent to what these guys could earn if they were, so the helicopter pilots in particular, if they were working on North Sea oil rigs, ferrying the workers out from places like Aberdeen to the oil rigs. It was a similar kind of salary. So I don't think, they could purely argue they had to do this to pay their bills. There were other types of jobs, particularly for the pilots, maybe not so for some of the ex-infantry guys. Yeah, I guess that gives you an idea of some of the amounts of money involved.
So the guy over there.
Just following on from that, did David Walker own the equity the whole way through, or was it like the East India Company and you're sort of getting more and more people in to keep the wheels turning?
Yeah, so David Walker initially wasn't the most senior player in Keenie Meenie. He'd been a major in the SAS, and there were guys like Colonel Johnson who'd been more senior, and there was a brigadier, and they'd both been commanders of SAS regiments. So they were the main players initially, but as the years went on, David Walker did seem to acquire a greater stake in the company, and certainly when Saladin was made more prominent, he set up an entity called Saladin Holdings, and he was very much the main player in the formation of that company. So it does seem to have become, very much his entity now.
There's someone right at the back over there.
So I know in the U.S. there's a law in the books called the Alien Torts Claims Act, which has been used by people who have been victimized by human rights abuses by mercenaries in places like Indonesia and Nigeria, like mostly like oil companies, to seek accountability in U.S. courts. Is there any sort of legal pathway like that in the UK to hold companies accountable for human rights abuses that happen abroad?
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have lawyers in the room can correct me, but I'm not aware we have a direct kind of equivalent of the Alien Torts Act, which is a very far-reaching and powerful piece of jurisdiction. there are possible civil law remedies that next of kin could make if they could prove they were directly bereaved by the company. But when you're talking about pilots up in helicopter gunships, it's quite hard to prove it directly. But there's also the criminal law in the UK. Some of these guys seem to have been either directly involved or accessories to murder, which has no statute of limitations, and universal jurisdiction applies for that. So there are real questions for the police, the Metropolitan Police in particular, which has a war crimes unit. As more and more of this evidence is being declassified and published, why aren't they investigating people like David Walker, who he turns 78 next month, so he's younger than Bernie Sanders. He's still registered as a director of Saladin to an address in southwest London. So if the police did want to question him about his role in these events, they'd know where to find him.
Anyone else? Yep. I don't know if you can project your voice. Oh no, we got a mic.
Thanks. I just, I wonder if you'd say something about the situation today. I mean, this is a shocking story, and one half suspects that, there's a lot going on we don't know anything about. But this use of mercenaries and the kind of ruthlessness of altering other states' political systems and overturning leaders and so on and so forth. Could you comment on the situation today? How bad is this? Is it worse than when you were investigating it, or is it about the same, or what?
I don't think that much has really changed. People in the private security industry will try and tell you that a lot has changed, that the sort of thing Keenie Meenie did in the 1980s or Executive Outcomes did in the 1990s could never happen today. But I think that's not true. I think precisely because there's been no accountability for what happened in the 1980s, there's every likelihood that this kind of thing could happen again. There was a company called Spear Operations Group, which was mainly American contractors, who were working with the Emiratis in Yemen. They were flying drones and taking part in combat operations in Yemen. So there are still things like this going on.
Okay, I think, we should wrap up now. But just before we do, so when is the film coming out, and how can people see it?
The premiere is going to be in Norway at the very beginning of May, and then we're still looking at festivals in the UK and other areas in Europe and North America over the next few months. But it'll be available hopefully by the end of the year, when we can start doing screenings all over the place.
So can we have a round of applause, please, for Phil and Lou?
Can we also, I just want to say thank you to Angus and Artika and Vuru, who are in the audience and have helped make all of this possible.
Thank you. And so, you guys can get a copy of the book over there, and I think Phil will be signing them as well. So thank you so much for coming.